adjust my mic. Is it okay? Speaking wise? Funkar det eller? Jag tror det. Då är det någon annan som är påslagen kanske. Okej, ja exakt. Ja men gärna. Jag är nummer 1. I'll try again. Hear me better now? Kan turn lite till tror jag. Ja. Så där. Mycket puff för lite. Så där.
Kommer någon röst eller?
I can try again. That's much better. Put it on like that. I think this is good. Hello, everyone. Welcome here to Malmö. And we should also say hello to the people that watch this online as well. This seminar is called Electric Mobility and Charging Infrastructure in Nordic Cities. And this seminar is actually a part of a project which is carried out now under the Swedish Presidency in the Nordic Council of Ministers. So it will be a big project about that. I'll just have some background slides before we head off and talk to the cities about this issue. To a little bit situate the Nordic conditions. We have some friends here both from the US and the UK and India. So just a little bit background about the Nordic countries. We have 5 countries in the Nordic region. It's Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden and Norway. And in total with 27 million inhabitants. We're not that very densely populated. We're 17 inhabitants per square kilometer, which is way below the EU average. And we have approximately 1 passenger car per 2 inhabitants. And this is also way below the US market, for example, where it's 1.7 cars per 2 inhabitants. And we're here to talk about electric mobility, and then it's interesting to see the electricity mix. And as you can see, we have very good conditions. We have very much renewable fuels in our electricity production. And it's also there way below the EU average. We have some short definitions here that we will use. This seminar only talks about the plug-in electric vehicles that actually have an impact on the electricity grid. And there we have the battery electric vehicle, which only has an electric engine. And the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, where you have also an internal combustion engine for that range extending trips. And we will also talk a little bit about public charging and non-public charging, where the public charging is more or less what you see on the streets along transport corridors. And the non-public charging is more or less private charging at a house or at a rented parking space or at a workplace, for example. And then we have the normal charging and the fast charging, a lot of terms here to be used, where the normal charging is where you charge, where you basically park your car anyway. Where the fast charging, you more or less think about the DC charging, a little bit faster, 50 kilowatts, and more of that. So that's sort of the basic terminology. And then moving on to the market, the Nordic market on plug-in electric vehicles. There's almost 250,000 plug-in electric vehicles in the Nordic countries. And even though we only comprise 0.5% of the global population, we actually comprise 8% of the global PV market here. And as you can see, the biggest market share is Norway. And on the second place there is Iceland, which promoted a very progressive policy framework last year. And on the third place is Sweden, and it's the biggest market share in the EU. And then it's Finland, and then on the bottom there is Denmark, which is sort of a good example of what happens when you don't have consistent policies. We will not go into that, but Denmark had a lot of policies, and then they were taken away, and then they're back again. I'll just go through quickly the policies. This is for the vehicles. And as you can see, it's really difficult to see, but they're actually a bit of light blue here as well. The light blue should be seen as the local policies, where the brighter blues are national policies. And in this context, it's interesting to know that in Sweden and in Finland, we only have national policies, but in the other countries, there are local policies where actually the cities can do different policies themselves. And then some background on the charging infrastructure. Again, as you see, the majority of the vehicles operate in Norway, and they also have a lot of charging infrastructure. But the great advantage here is, speaking about electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, you a lot of times end up with an egg or hen discussion. What comes first? But a big advantage here in the Nordic countries is that we have a widespread deployment of block heaters. We need them to start our cars in the winter. So we already have an infrastructure system that provides electricity right up to the parking space. And then you can see along the different Nordic countries that they've used different approaches to deploy public charging. And there have been procurement schemes and direct investment support, but also research support to understand both the technologies and how these can be less expensive, but also to understand these new behaviors. What are the new demands for charging infrastructure? And all of these graphs comes from the publication Nordic EV Outlook, which was presented, I think, in March. So it's a quite new publication that sort of go on insights the policies and the developments in the Nordic region. And there are some important findings there that I want you to bring with you, at least in my opinion, the most important findings. And it's the case that this is still a niche market. It's very easy to think that plug-in electric vehicles are becoming more general, but because it's everywhere. Even royal family members go from their weddings in electric cars. But it's not. It's still a niche market. And most users are still these early adopters, and they still need some policies to sort of keep this market growing. And it's also really important to facilitate the home charging. It's the most important charging point, and could actually solve a lot of the barriers for electric vehicles. And in the case of the Nordic region, it's a very robust electricity system that we got here. If we can't do it, there's not many other regions in the world that can do this transition. So that was a little bit about the background on the Nordic countries. And we will start here about the experience from Copenhagen. So welcome, Kasper.
I need to turn this on.
Yep. Mute. Here you go.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes. Hello, my name is Kasper Isbrand. I'm from the city of Copenhagen. I'm a coordinator for e-mobility in Copenhagen. I work in the technical environmental department. The reason why we're working with e-mobility in Copenhagen is that we have a climate plan and we have a goal to be CO2 neutral by 2025. And the way to get there is not through e-mobility alone. It's a lot of political measures. We want to reduce the power consumption, move the energy production from renewable to renewable sources, mostly wind energy, and increase green mobility overall, not just move people from fossil cars to electric cars, but also from cars to bikes. So we want to mostly move people to green mobility in general, and EVs is a small part of this, and decrease the overall municipal CO2 emissions. Copenhagen has already decreased its CO2 emissions with 31% from 2005 to 2014, and right now we are just around the midway to moving towards 2025, and we still have a long way to go. The main issue is that our population is growing here towards 2025, and we want to, at the same time, reduce the CO2 emissions from Copenhagen. So it's a really big challenge, we also in Copenhagen, when we're working with e-mobility, we have to accept that it's the fourth priority. Usually, it's public transportation and biking and walking as always the first priority. And when we working with cars, we want to people to use car sharing, and people who cannot live without a car in Copenhagen should, we hope to move towards electric cars. This is our specific goals. They're made back in 2012, and they are quite ambitious. The goal is that 20 to 30% of the cars should be EVs, and 30 to 40% of the heavy-duty vehicles should use alternative fuels, and all our city administration's vehicles should use new fuels. But as written here, it goes along with that we move people from over to using public transport, and also biking and pedestrian transport as well. It has to be mentioned that the goals were set back in 2012, and at that point we had Better Place in Copenhagen, who had invested a lot in public infrastructure, and there was an early optimism at these days. So right now we are just about to present the midway evaluation for our politicians, and it's pretty clear that the transportation area is one of the areas that we are not going to reach the goals exactly. So we'll have to implement some new political measures perhaps, and it's probably what's required is probably something is required from the national level, and there's a little limited what we can do there. But for example, the climate plan was based on the fact that we had at that point it was promised that we could make a congestion ring in Copenhagen, and it wasn't allowed from the national base plan. So we still have an issue there from the national legislation. So right now in Denmark in total we have less than 10,000 EVs, and compared to Norway, where Marianne is from, they have at least 100,000, much more. Of course the main challenge is the incentives, and we have a very limited and as a city we have fairly limited measures that we can implement here as compared to Norway. They have had a very ambitious government plan for implementing EVs, and so with including exemption from road tax and public parking fees and toll payments and access to bus lanes and all these, Marianne will tell more about. So in Denmark we like to compare ourselves to the other Nordic countries, but we lack a little political will that has been in Norway in order to reach our goals here. This is the specific sales in Denmark. You can see the green lines here, the sales for 2018, and it's I think it's fairly limited. It's around 400 electric vehicles per month that has been sold, and it's still a very, very limited percentage of the overall sales. But it's still, we have seen a small improvement in Denmark overall, but it's very limited. As for now, there's still there used to be a tax exemption for EVs, and now I think it's around 20%. There's 20% tax on the EVs right now. So it's still there's still a long way to go there. Yeah, these are the areas that we are working with in Copenhagen. The city administration's own vehicles is one thing. Then there's the infrastructure and parking, cars in the city, and of course the legal framework. One of the steps is that we want the passenger, our own city administration's passenger cars to be CO2 neutral, and we are already at 85% there. So that's one thing, that we are exchanging our own fossil-driven vehicles with electric or hydrogen cars. We have, I think, 16 hydrogen cars, and the rest are mostly electric. The larger vehicles are to use new fuels, and we want to implement demands for our suppliers also in our tenders. Yeah, this is you can see the percentage of the city administration's own cars, which is by now it's up to 85%, and the goal is that by 2025 it should be 100%. For the concept of electric buses, it's a very good way to implement CO2 neutral transport and reduce noise and local emissions. We have decided that all future tenders in Copenhagen regarding buses must be electric buses. And also the goal is here to reach 100% EV buses by 2025. From 2019, all our tenders must be for electrical buses, starting with 2 bus lines in 2019. So it's going to be around 40 buses there and 15% of the total fleet. So we are on our way there, and we have a Lord Mayor who has been very insistent on this area in particular. So we have a belief that we will reach our goals here. For the garbage, the vehicles, it's also decided that they must run on biogas. Today, 87 of our 135 garbage trucks are run by biogas instead of diesel. And by this year, we should reach 90 trucks, garbage trucks. So this is an area that's moving ahead as well. We have experimented with public procurements, working together with other municipalities, and have achieved a cut of up to 29% in the prices of EVs. Right now, it's a little on hold, this area, because the city of Copenhagen has decided to use another tender system, but there's still an ambition to use the public purchases as a way to move the market. As for our mayors, we have a new mayor for the technical environmental department who is using as a transport in the daily life. She's using bikes, electric bikes, and a carpool if she really needs a car. And the Lord Mayor drives a Tesla, which is sort of it's a good public signal to send anyway. So we have a will there, but the problem is always when there's you need to make the hard political decisions here. Yeah, that's just a minute. In the city of Copenhagen, it can be quite hard to find a parking spot in Copenhagen. So since 2010, we have reserved parking spots for EVs and allowed for charging operators to set up charging infrastructure. Right now, we have around 500 parking spots reserved for EVs in Copenhagen, and we have decided on the political level to expand this number to 1,000. So, but we, as a city, we don't invest in the infrastructure itself. we allow the operators, Clever and Eon, who took over the Better Places infrastructure, to invest in this infrastructure, to invest in these. So they are the one financing it, and as a city, we do the reserving of the parking spaces and set up signs, and so this is, you could say, our contribution to this. And in the early days, in the early optimistic days, we decided to make it free to park in Copenhagen, but from a state level, we were told after a few years that we are not allowed to do so. So it's been quite complicated since then, and we actually took like 5 years to get a law through that we could give some environmental discount for parking, and but at the last minute there was a limit to this discount, so you can give a discount for up to 5,000 Danish kroner a year per car, which is very complicated to work with. So right now the only discount for environmental cars in Copenhagen is for the residence permits, which is where it's cheaper to have a more environmental car, to own a more environmental friendly car, but it's not much. We recently had political debate on this, where our administration suggested that the parking residence permits should be raised up to 10,000 kroner per year, sort of like they have in Stockholm, for example, and more like. But it has not yet been decided, and I think there's a long way to go, because it's not a popular political thing to go through with. I know they did the same in Stockholm, but it's been so far we haven't had much luck getting this through. But this would be a serious incentive if you could actually make it more profitable to own an EV. But right now we are getting a little blocked from the state level also. So yes, this is the infrastructure in Copenhagen. It's quite a good spread of infrastructure. In the middle is Frederiksberg, which is a municipality within Copenhagen, which also has decent infrastructure for parking. So we work on the city level on planning in favor of EVs, and what we also want to do is make development projects, working on establishing multimodal hubs, and mobility as a service is also quite hot at the moment. We have an international ITS Congress in Copenhagen in September, where we're going to make a trial with this mobility as a service, and that could be a way to implement more electric mobility in the use of transport. Yes. In the city overall, we are working with green taxes also, along with the capital region of Copenhagen. We want to promote green taxes, but right now as only very, very limited use of green taxes. So the capital region has agreed to support public infrastructure and fast chargers for taxis, and we are hoping to move the market a little along with these. Then we have quite a large fleet of city cars, car-sharing cars from Arriva's Drive Now and Green Mobility. We have 400 Drive Now cars and 450 electric Green Mobility cars that you can you can pick up anytime, anywhere in the street, and move it to another place in the city. But it's mostly for the short trips. That's quite a large fleet, and we are working on implementing this with the travel planner on a national level. So it could be easier for people to sort of compare this, taking an electric car compared to other modes of transport, and especially people's own cars. We want to replace the use of this. We have a car sharing strategy saying that at least 700 round trip we should reach 700 round-trip car-sharing cars by 2020, and at least 30% of these should be electric, fuel cell-driven. Right now we are only around halfway there, maybe around 300 there. So there's still a long way to go. But this is for the round-trip cars. There's not a specific goal for the city cars that we showed before. Also, we've been working with development projects like this one on Vesterbro in Copenhagen, where we have, it's maybe a little hard to see, but this is a public park, a small public park. We've removed 20 parking spots in one street, and in one side of the street we turned into car sharing spots with spots for both types of car sharing cars, and also for our electric bike system, city bike system. And the other side of the street was turned into a small mini park for the residents, and there was quite a good response here. We made a project in Copenhagen and also in Frederiksberg. That's a sort of a first steps towards mobility hubs as we see it. This was a trial and was quite well received in the area. Though some people, there's always, when you remove parking spots, there's always residents protesting for losing the parking spots. But it was overall quite well received. And thus, for the budget negotiations in September, we have suggested to make a larger trial. Overall, the response was pretty good from the trial. I already talked a little bit about the taxis here. Right now, it's a very, very small part of the taxis that are actually electric. So, but the airport is also implementing electric fast charging for the taxis, and we are hoping this can change something, along with maybe making reserving some of the taxi spots in Copenhagen on attractive places to make it more the business case better for taxi drivers to move towards greener mobility. We are also experimenting with city logistics. This is mostly this is not from Copenhagen, but we are making agreements with larger companies in order to green the logistic systems, and it's right now in an early stage. But we experience a large goodwill from the larger companies in order to transform their transport systems towards more environmentally friendly transport. I've already mentioned a few of these. The tax incentives are from a government state. It's very limited what we can do. We need a higher ambition on the national level. Right now, the government has presented what they call the greenest energy plan ever made by any government. But I think it's maybe a little twisted, because it's at least the main goal of the government's plan is to make the electricity cheaper, so people can use more green electricity. It's quite limited what you see on the national level. The main problem is that it's been turned a lot cheaper to buy cars in general. The registration has been lowered, so the gap to electric cars is been quite is way too small. That's not a good business case in Denmark to do that. As a city, we don't have we're not allowed to make a road toll or the congestion rings as we have made a part of our climate plan usually. Also for the autonomous vehicles, the market is developing quickly, and our government is in the process of developing rules for these kind of vehicles. In Copenhagen, what we are telling the national level is that we think as a whole the autonomous vehicles is quite fine, but we want to encourage to focus the focus on shared mobility and green fuels if it has to make sense for the cities. Yeah. So overall, Copenhagen we're working on the smart city level. We can do more with integrated solutions, making green modes of transport the more obvious choice. The mobility as a service is one way to go, but in overall we want to reduce the share of cars in total, move it to new vehicles, new fuels. Biogas and synthetic fuels is one way to go. EVs cannot probably stand alone yet, and yeah, overall it's. There's still room for improvement here with the political climate these days, but we are certainly willing to work with what we have. Yeah. So I think this is. I don't know if we take questions now or later.
If someone has a short question, we can have it now. Otherwise, we have a panel discussion in the end where you also can ask your questions. Any question for Copenhagen now?
Okay. Good.
Right, but then we wait with them till the panel. And now it's Eva Sunnerstedt from Stockholm. There you go. Sorry, and
thank you. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here to speak about my favorite subject, electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. I work for the city of Stockholm, where I am in charge of the city's Clean Vehicles and Fuels program. And personally, I work a lot with electric vehicles then and charging infrastructure. So I'm going to talk to you about the experience of establishing public home charging and public charging then in Stockholm. And just one slide saying, you know, in Stockholm we're almost 1 million people. There's slightly over 2 million people in the entire region. We have about 330,000 cars in Stockholm. We are a city built on 14 different islands, connected with 54 bridges. It's part of the beauty, but also part of the transportation problem, the limited access between the different islands. And we have a lot of public transport, especially in peak hours. Stockholmers are very good at using public transport, very high figures for being a European capital. We have a congestion charging zone. You pay when you enter and exit the city, regardless of what type of vehicle you have. We also have an environmental zone for heavy vehicles already since the 1990s, and now discussions are being held also to introduce that for passenger cars. We have improved air quality, and we are supposed to be a fossil fuel-free city by 2040, and it's this that's driving us towards more electromobility, of course, where the transport sector seems to be the hardest one to tackle when it comes to fossil fuel-free city. So we have a climate strategy, a roadmap on how to go there. So public charging facilities today in Stockholm, in Sweden. First of all, there are 1,300 locations in total, different locations. One location can have several types of units, so around 5,000 units for public charging in Sweden. In Stockholm, we have about 180 locations and about 1,300 different units at these locations. I should say anything about the number of cars then probably as well. We're slightly over 52,000 chargeable cars in Sweden today. 25% of them, about 13,000, are actually in Stockholm. We're far from 25% of the total car fleet. We have less than 10% of the total car fleet in Stockholm, but we have over 25% of the number of chargeable cars in Stockholm. So charging is asked for in our city. We started out with our parking company, Stockham Parking Company, who is 100% owned by the city. They own a lot of parking garages in the inner city and also outdoor parking in the outskirts of the city. They started the introduction with public charging, and this is one of their locations. They currently put up large amounts in new garages. At least 20% of the facility is equipped with charging. They don't reserve these for electric vehicles. They put them at the end of the parking garage, and then you can fill the garage in two ways, so to speak. The electric cars will go all the way down, and the non-electric will fill it from the other side of the garage, and then you fill it from two sides. So when the garage is full, it's full for everybody. So you can stand on this parking space even if you don't have an electric car. And this is a way to put up a lot of charging once you do the installation, and then you can grow from there without lacking any revenue. Of course, if there is a lot of electric vehicles coming, you can also start reserving later on, but it's not something that's important today. It's mainly one phase, 16 amps, 3.7 kilowatts in this public. And it's the same on the outdoor parking spaces. They are mainly public in this way. They have around 700 unique units like this in operation today, and an additional 300 that are reserved for a specific user. And any user renting today from Stockham Parking can ask for a charging unit and will get one. You get then an additional cost of 400 Swedish crowns per month for that parking space, and then the electricity is included. When we're talking about this type of charging where it's open for everybody, you just pay for the parking and the charging is included. And this is at the Stockholm Parking's facilities. So our next step was to provide fast charging on street. And this is one of the examples of that. We have private companies, just like what you explained in Copenhagen, offering this on private land. I will come back to that. And our next step has then been to also have normal charging on street. And usually you see a mixture of fast charging and normal charging put together like this. We call them, or our politicians call them, charging streets. It's a street where you have several parking spaces where you can charge side by side. And we believe it's good to group them like this, so it's easier for the EV drivers to find them. And it's also, once you start digging in the street, you might as well put up several at the same spot. So that's why there is a mixture like this. And also the normal charging that's put up on street, it's done by private actors at their expense, but the city provides the land. So the public charging on street then, we sign access right agreements with private companies who want to put up charging at their own expense on street. We sign access right agreements with 5 years mainly, and it's prolonged 1 year at a time if nobody say anything. So if you do fast charging, we have some requirements about the standards you need to follow, and also normal charging to follow the European standards, of course. We also have that you need to give data to the city. We need to know how much they are in operation, how much they are used, so that we can learn from that as well. So the lessons we learned so far then is that we like to choose streets like this, where it's also possible to add on maybe even more charging later, because like I said, we like to group them. So we're looking for locations where you can have several charging units at the same place. And when we're talking about fast charging, it's important that it is a parking space where you park 90 degrees towards the sidewalk. So you have the back or the front or the back of the car targeting the sidewalk. So because otherwise it's much harder to do with a long and in this case quite heavy cord when you're supposed to fast charge. So you'd have difficulties with cars sometimes parked in the wrong direction of traffic, which is not allowed in Stockholm, and we would like to, have it easy. So that's why this is what we prefer. We have experienced that we try to get away from trees because trees are important in Stockholm and the roots are sometimes in the way, so we try to avoid that. We also had a discussion in the beginning about lighting and close to coffee, but we're talking in the inner city of Stockholm, and there's access to all different kinds of services, and we don't allow really the charging operators to have any special lighting or advertisement or anything on the charging poles. They should be rather integrated to the city. We had a discussion also in the beginning of the colors, for instance. So like you see, we'd like them to like blend in the city. There should not be advertisement poles. You need to know that in this case it's Vattenfall you should call if something is wrong, but it shouldn't be an orange or green or very bright colored thing. It should more blend into the city. And they need to be in operation at least 90% of the time, or you can lose the contract ahead of time. Some people think that we've been generous, and who knows, we might be even stricter in the next round, but this is what we had so far. It also needs to be enough room on the sidewalk so we can clear it in the winter from snow, but also sweep it in the summer times and so on. So machinery has to be able to walk through, so we don't have to hand clear the streets or anything like that. Signs and legal aspects have been the most complicated thing. It's not the technique, it's the legal frameworks that are not in place, and because it has not so far taken, the parking regulations in Sweden has not taken electric vehicles into consideration. And it's also when you do access right agreements, how should you do it and in what way? And I just put in one of the quite tall signs, road signs, showing that this is a street for charging. And it's very hard to understand what this says, I agree, but it's legally right. So if we end up in court, the city of Stockholm will come out in favor. But we also, of course, want the citizens to understand what it says on the pole. But so we have, this is complicated. And it's not actually the city that decides this, it's on the government level. So legal frameworks are important, and I think when I started to work with this, I did not expect myself to be like an expert in Swedish parking legislation. But that's a benefit that I have now been able to tackle. So then the pricing on street, for the fast charging, it's actually free parking for 30 minutes because we believe it's not really a parking place, it's a charging place where you should be charging and then leave. And then the electricity, it's up to the operators to decide what you should be paying, but currently it's between 3 and 340 Swedish crowns per minute. And I think that's also good, because if you pay per minute, you leave when you have enough. For normal charging, it's the regular parking fee, and then the operators charge 3 Swedish crowns per kilowatt hours. In Sweden, it's not possible to have any differentiation in parking fees, so it has to be the same. If there are different apps you can download, so you just pay once, and that the app operator is dividing the payment between the city and in the provider of the energy. Otherwise, you can also pay twice, of course, but then you can also have an arrangement where you maybe have like a monthly payment system for the city, and then you pay for this has been also a little complicated. In the beginning, we wanted to say that, we said that the operator needed to agree on a system, a unite system. Well, they did not do that. And if we would have been persistent, we still wouldn't have any on-street charging in Stockholm. So we said, okay, have at least 2 different kind of payment methods at your charging pole. And now it's not only us that want this united payment, it's all the EV drivers as well. So we have a more force into actually asking for them to try to find a unite system. Okay, we have mapped the entire inner city for good locations. We have published the map online. And so now different operators can come to us and say, okay, we want to put up charging at this location. So we had 8 different parameters we look to. You need to have enough wide sidewalk to be able to clean it. It should be central, but not on the streets where we plan to have new bus lanes and bicycle lanes and so on. So, and also we'd like to have a mixed area where there's both residence and office buildings, avoid big trees and all these parking towards the side is much better than the long side parking, for instance. So the map is online. You see the website. Here you can see spots that have already been taken and where charging has been put up. Also where there's been reservation. There's a possible that some actors have already said that they're interested in this area. And we have 3 operators that already put up charging during last year. And there are currently 110 units like this out on the streets, different parking places where you can charge. And we have another 150 coming up this year probably, and our goal is to have 500 by 2020. And then we will evaluate and see where we go from there on. So we have so far 6 operators that have put up interest to put up then these 150 that's probably going to come up later this year. So I'm going to say something also about home charging. I think that home charging is the most important charging place. Where you park your car at home is where you want to charge. It's the most easy charging place, and it also, we can see for our own drivers at the city fleet, we have a lot of electric vehicles in the city fleet. Our drivers say that it's actually saves them time because they don't have to go to the filling station anymore. It saves time. It's you plug it in the evening, it's full in the morning, ready to go. You don't have to bother about anything like that. So that's very good. So in Stockholm, 90% of the Stockholmers live in an apartment. And out of those 90%, 55% live in a multifamily home where they own the house together with their neighbors. And they have a lot of parking places, and that needs to be charging places, according to me. And these multifamily homes are run by a board, by some of the elected people that lives in the house. And of course they have other things to do during the day. They have their regular work, and then in the evening they're supposed to take care of their house as well. So they have limited knowledge and limited interest. So we thought it was very important to give them easy information on how to put up charging and also how to apply for the national funding that's actually available for home charging like this. So we have put up a website called Fixa Laddplats, and there you have this step-by-step guide how to do it, a handbook, you have some films, good examples, and frequently asked questions. And we arranged a lot of seminars last year. A lot of people came to our events, where we also have exhibitions where you could see and meet the charging operators, the operators that would sell you the equipment for home charging. And we also have many other now cities in Sweden copying the campaign. And we can see that there is a lot of charging being now available, home charging in Stockholm due to this activity, which I think has been very important. And other initiatives is that we require at least 20% charging in all new parking facilities that's being built in Stockholm on land owned by the city. And Stockholm owns a lot of land, so we can require this if we own the land. But if some private owner owns the land, we cannot put the same kind of requirement. Electric vehicles are also first priority when we buy vehicles to our own city fleet, of course, and we also require electric vehicles and renewable fuels in many transport procurements that we do, transportation services. And Martina asked me to give you 3 advice. If you are a city interested in electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, what are my 3 best advice? I have many. I have picked 3. Okay, knowledge about electric vehicles. I think that it's very important to give the citizens knowledge about electric vehicles. I think all know what an electric vehicle is, but they're not aware that they are so available, so well functioning, that they are really realistic for a lot of day-to-day operation. And this also includes businesses in cities, for instance. So more information and test driving. I mean, you've heard about the EV smile, haven't you? That's what you see on the face of a person who has just been driving an EV for the first time, and they exit the car and they're all happy. So we need to spread that more. Okay, so it's not until you test drive it that you actually realize how good it is. Okay, so signal from society, like Stockholm, you need to walk the talk. You need to do this trip yourself as a city. You need to introduce this vehicle, see how they work. You have to be the good example to start the snowball, so to say. So public procurements, regulations, and so on are very important in this field. And then, of course, access to charging is very important as well. And then home charging, I would say, is the number one to start working with. So, thank you. That was my presentation.
Thank you very much. Good. And we also have time for a short question. Otherwise, we can save them for later, where you can talk to all 4 cities. But
Yes.
yeah, thank you, Eva. Let me
Thank
take
you.
these questions later. Right. And now we welcome Marianne from Oslo. Right.
Yes.
There you go. If you want to.
Good morning. My name is Marianne Mølmen. I come from the city of Oslo. And we like to call ourselves the EV capital. So I'm going to give you a brief presentation on why and how we got there. So it started out with the environment. We had a verdict actually already in 2008, where we decided to have a 10-point plan to reduce emissions in the city. And we have about 61% of the emissions coming from transport. So the only way that we can reduce emissions in our city is to boost the green shift in transportation. So we started out with, the national government started out making EVs a reasonable choice. So private cars are quite expensive in Norway. We have quite a lot of taxes when you purchase the car. So there are high taxes on fossil-fueled cars. There's also a 25% VAT, and there's also a registration fee that's based on how much that car pollutes. So if it weighs a lot and it has a lot of emissions, it will cost a lot to register. And EVs are exempt from both VAT and the registration fee, as well as hybrid and plug-in hybrids. They have to pay those fees, but they get a small discount to make up for the extra weight of the battery. So when you look at just the purchase price, this is the base price. You can see that the electric car is usually, it's always more expensive than the fossil-fueled cars. And that's because the fossil-fueled cars have had about 100 years to perfect their engineering and production, but the EVs have, well, we were there about 100 years ago as well, but we've only really come this far right now. But when you add the registration fee and the VAT, this is what the consumer sees when they go online to see the prices of the cars. So when they look at the Volkswagen website in Norway, the e-Golf and the regular Golf cost just about the same, which makes it sort of a reasonable choice to go with the e-Golf, or at least they have a sort of a neutral baseline. These are the prices that the consumer sees when they go online in Sweden and Denmark. And there might be a super miljöbilspremie that you can deduct from the e-Golf price in Sweden, but it might not be visible on the sort of the sticker price of the car just immediately when you compare the prices and the cars. And this also happens when you look at the larger family cars. So if you want a 5-seater or a 7-seater car that has a lot of cargo space so you can go on holidays or vacations, it's only about a 7,000 euro gap between a Volvo and a Tesla in Norway. So when you're spending about 60,000 euros on a car, you probably have a little bit extra to make the jump to the electric version. But if you are spending about 35,000 euros, you might not have, well, twice the price to spend on an electric family car. But it's not only about purchasing the car, it's also about all of those daily or monthly use incentives, which makes it possible and reasonable to actually drive and use the electric car because you save so much daily or monthly. The years are the years that these incentives first came in place. So many of them are not exactly new, but they've been there in the back all the time, from back when we had those small plastic cars. And you can get free access on the toll roads, you can get free parking, you can get access to use the bus and the taxi lanes. And all of these daily incentives, they make it reasonable to actually buy that electric car because you see that, okay, it costs about the same to purchase it, but when you take all of those daily incentives into place, you see that using that electric car is a lot cheaper than using a fossil-fueled car. Some of these incentives have changed from being completely free to being about 50% reduced, but it still makes it reasonable to go the electric way. We've also had a little bit of change in the policies. You can see in the bus and the taxi lane, it's quite empty. It's just the small red car there. Once we got a huge growth in electric vehicles, the bus and the taxi lane also became quite crowded. But instead of eliminating access to the bus and taxi lane, we opened up so that if you were 2 people or more in the electric car, then you could drive in the bus and taxi lane during rush hour. So that also gave a good incentive to start driving with your partner at work, for example. But we also know that you need the right products in order to make the EVs grow. So you can see that we've had a lot of these incentives in place since the 90s and 2000s, but it was only when we got the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, when we got the larger producers start making cars that could handle maybe a small crash on the motorway, or that had enough 5 seats or 7 seats and that had the cargo space and the range, that's when we started getting the big consumer uptake. So you need a combination of both the incentives, but you also need the product. My first electric car was one of those red little plastic cars, and it was fun to drive, but it was a bit loud on the motorway. And it didn't really have a lot of cargo space. So I can see that might not have been the most selling cars back in those days. And then we see what happens when everything is combined. We get a huge uptake in the sales, and we also know that a lot of people are really happy with their cars as well. The EV Association does an annual survey amongst their members, and the EV ownership and satisfaction is really high. So as I mentioned in the first slide, what Oslo started doing was building 400 charging points in 4 years. And once we got to 2011, we saw that the uptake of the electric cars were really starting to take off. So we continued building the charging stations, and we also continued to support building private charging stations in private parking garages or for businesses and building co-ops. So that's helped build more than 1,300 public charging points that are owned by the city, as well as about 1,000 semi-private or private charging points that are also available. And what we also saw is that the public, when they saw that the charging points were on the streets, they were available, they could choose to, if they wanted to choose an electric car, they actually had a place in their neighborhood to charge. That really also helped get the EVs out there and kickstart the e-mobility in Oslo. So one of our challenges, like Sweden or Stockholm and our other neighbor cities, is that we have a huge population that lives in apartment buildings. Often there can be waiting lists, and many of them are dependent on the on-street parking and charging stations that the city has. We also have a challenge when it comes to commercial vehicles and freight vehicles. The model variation of these vehicles is still quite, there are a few vehicles to choose from, and the range often isn't that good. So this is one of our challenges for the next few years, to make sure that we get the growth also in this segment and not just in the private ownership. So these are some of the areas that we will be focusing on this year and the next coming years, to establish fast chargers, also to make sure that we also get more charging indoors. We do see a lot of our streets being converted from parking to parklets, like in Copenhagen, or having bicycle lanes. So if we place the charging points indoors, we get a larger risk of having them there for a longer time. We're also looking at green mobility houses, which is a combination of indoor parking and charging, but also bicycle parking, for example. And we're also improving the public transportation fleet in the city to make it fossil-free, because we still want people to mainly use public transportation when traveling. These are some of the quick charging stations that we've helped establish. These are owned and operated by private fast charging companies, but a few of these are on public land. And these ones are also targeted towards the commercial users, so we have a few tests where they can book fast charging slot time to secure or give them a more safe sort of charging. We're also involved in a few European projects in order to share our experiences and learn from our neighbors. We're also not only focusing on the private cars, but we're also electrifying the buses in Oslo, electrifying the taxi fleets. We also have an electric car ferry up on the west coast in Norway. And we're also a consumer ourselves. So one of the other points in that 10-point plan was to switch out the municipal fleet to become electric. We're also testing out e-bikes in our fleet. And at our offices, we have a new building with solar panels and car and bike sharing, and no parking spaces for employees. So another good point about switching out the municipal fleet is, like Eva said, you get a lot of more people into electric cars that wouldn't necessarily drive an electric car or test it, but when they have it at work, they sort of become forced to drive one and try one, and they realize how fun and convenient it can be. So when we want to give a few advices to our other cities, you can transform the city's fleet and start with your own. We also see that e-bikes is a good supplement to the fleet. This one is being used for home care services for the elderly, and especially in the Nordic region, at least it could work quite well 3 out of 4 seasons in the year. And you also have to look at the whole picture, so everything must be connected and make sense. So you can't just remove parking, but you need to replace it with a better alternative like bicycle lanes or bike sharing or parklets or something that makes sense and gives value to the users. So thank you.
Then again, we have some time if we have some specific questions for Oslo. Nope. Then we'll hear more about from Marianne later, and then we have the last presentation. But first, we'll do a sort of a small exercise to wake up a little bit. How many of you in here has driven a plug-in electric vehicle? I wanted exercise. Stand up. Oh, yeah, stand up. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I thought that would be exercise for quite a few people. Thank you very much. Then we know we have a crowd in here which has done this EV Smile trip. Right, then it's Max from Malmö is coming up.
Oh yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah? No? Yes. Yes? Okay. Thank you very much.
Och där har du det.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I'm from the city of Malmö, so I guess it might be my role to welcome you to Malmö as well. Welcome to Malmö. I hope you get to enjoy the city outdoors as well as indoors. It's a great city, always sunny, as you can see outside. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about electric mobility and charging infrastructure in Malmö. And in Sweden we have a saying about the cousin from the countryside. And I think today I will be that small cousin, a little bit boring, coming from the countryside, compared to the large cities we've heard from this morning. Malmö is a smaller city, and we do our best within the field. And I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about our own municipal fleet of cars. And then I'm going to focus mostly on public charging infrastructure in Malmö. Sorry. So, about the municipal vehicle fleet, we've been working ambitious since the 90s actually, and we had several electric vehicles in the 90s driving around in Malmö, municipal cars. And today we have a strategy for clean vehicles based on the overall objective of fossil-free municipality by 2020. And we say in this strategy that at first hand, when leasing a new car, a municipal department should always choose an electric vehicle. And the goal, by the year 2020, we should have 15% electric vehicles among within the fleet. And that means approximately 125 electric vehicles. Today we have approximately 6%, and that's quite a bit lower than Stockholm, for example. So we have to speed up a bit in Malmö. Okay, so as for public charging in Malmö, we have today approximately 1,500 electric vehicles and plug-in vehicles in Malmö, and we have approximately 200 charging points at around 50 places, charging units, as Eva said, at 50 locations. So that's quite a good ratio at the moment. So far, so good. Okay, now I muted it. Sorry. When thinking about the municipal role in this within this process of charging infrastructure and the development of charging infrastructure, we have been working with 4 steps. And when it comes to the first step, It's obviously important to work as a municipality with supporting information, impartial, objective information, and also to promote in different ways this development. Also, it's very important to work with our public parking facilities, especially with focus on parking houses, multi-story car parks in the city that is publicly owned by our parking company, Parking Malmö. And then on the third step, we can see that we have a possibility to put up charging infrastructure on the public in the public spaces, in the public streets. And furthermore, you can choose as a municipality to own and manage and operate the infrastructure yourself. But as we have seen, it's more common to use private operators through public tenders or corporations. So following from this stairway, we have proposed for our politicians guideline for public charging in Malmö. This is a proposal. We will have a political, hopefully, decision in August in the City Council. And in Swedish, you can read it. I'm just kidding. The brief version, in short, we say, at first hand, we should not have charging infrastructure in Malmö on public streets and in public spaces. As a municipality, we should not own, manage, and operate in-house. We should focus, as I said before, on charging points in public parking facilities at first hand, especially in parking houses, which are owned by the municipality. Promote, of course, private stakeholders and market solutions in an impartial way through recommendations, objective information, and also through public tenders, of course. So what has been happening in Malmö following these guidelines? We have, as I said, a public company, Parking Malmö, Parkering Malmö in Swedish. They have worked together with the energy company E.ON in Malmö for a while now, and just the other day, Friday, we had a kind of an event where we celebrated 100 public charging points at 11 public charging facilities. I think 10 of those are parking houses. The charging infrastructure is owned and managed and operated by E.ON, and finally, partly financed by national level funding. Klimatklivet, it's called. Parking Malmö has in total today more than 150 charging points in their facilities. Following from this, I was asked, Martina asked me to have some kind of recommendations, advice, and I will start out by saying that we think that you need to have focus on how you use public land, public spaces, and we have a Plan- och bygglagen, Planning and Building Act, right? In Sweden, it's a law, and it says, among several other things, that the public space should be used in a way so that the public good, the common good, is in focus. And whether charging infrastructure is a public good, we have been discussing for a long time in Malmö. And at the moment, we say that primarily we want the infrastructure within parking facilities, and we also want to encourage private parking companies to set up charging infrastructure in their facilities as well, of course. And we will also focus on private land instead of public spaces when it comes to charging infrastructure. This is our proposal to the politicians. And we will see in August what they say about this. But it's important to think about it. And we also think it's very important to have confidence in market solutions through public tenders. Of course, you can work together, like Parking Malmö work at the moment together with E.ON. That's important. And you also, as a municipality, has to be able to support and promote through impartial information and marketing. Of course, this is important as well. And finally, following the speed of change within this field, within the technology of the batteries, within the vehicle industry, as well as for the charging infrastructure, it's really important to be flexible and have a resilient strategy. And at the moment, our way is a bit more cautious, maybe, than the way chosen by the larger cities we've heard from. And this is an important point for discussion, I think, in the panel later on. And with this, I will promote this car. We will sell it outside after the workshop. You can order from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Right. Thank you very much. We will close there, and then we'll have a small panel. So please, can the presenters come up here again? You too, Max. And I'll bring over a table. It's much nicer to talk around the table, this round table thing. There you go. Tack. Exakt. Får jag bort datorn? Ska vi ta den, Erik? Perfekt. Right. Now we gathered some of the best expertise in this field that we have in the Nordics here. So does anyone have a question for the panel?
Crystal clear.
Yes. We have a mic for you here, and we have a colleague that will bring it to you.
Good morning. My name is Janki. I'm from India, representing the Ministry of Urban Development. So my question is, like it's common, I want to understand the financials of the establishing charging infrastructure. From what I understand from the presentation is, it's almost the private investor who is coming in, and whereas the city government in most of the cases is providing the public land as well. And there is charge to the electricity, and then I heard from Stockholm experience there is some sharing to the city government as well. If you could elaborate on the financials of putting up the charging infrastructure, it would be beneficial. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. You want to start? Yeah.
Yeah, the on-street in Stockholm then has been all financed by private companies who put up charging at their own expense. The land is provided for free, so of course that is some kind of benefit for them. If you're talking about a regular diesel or petrol station, it would most likely also be built on the city's own land, but they would have to pay like rent for that land. And it's the same, we provide the land, but we don't really provide the filling stations for petrol and diesel. So it's like the same here. In this case, we have then said that you can use the land for free. So that is a little different, but it's smaller pieces of land, and it's not the whole other type of infrastructure around it. When it comes to the indoor that the Stockholm Parking Authority is putting up, it's mainly on their expense, but there have also been some state funding that they have been able to apply for to pay part of their work. And actually, the actors that put up charging on street in Stockholm, the private actors, some of them have received funding from the European Commission or in the European funded projects. And there can also be some other types of state funding, but part of it, at least 50%, have been paid by them.
I can add that in Oslo we have always built all of the public on-street charging points ourselves. When we started out in 2008, we spent about 4 million kroners each year on building the infrastructure. This year we have a budget of about 32 million kroners to build about 600 charging points. So it's quite a lot of money it's a lot of funding. We also have a city government fund that was, the money came initially from the public, from your electricity bill, just a few cents from your electricity bill funded this energy environmental fund that is also supporting all of the private charging points in the apartment complexes. So that one supports, funds about 20% of your expenses when you want to install charging in apartment buildings. When it comes to the private or the fast charging infrastructure, we pay for everything. We let the private fast charging operators place their hardware there, so they pay for the fast charging station. We pay for some of the asphalt, but we also get 50% of the income from that fast charging station. So whatever the fast charging operator earns, we get about 50% back. So that sort of also helps fund some of the infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in Copenhagen, we do mostly like they do in Stockholm. It's publicly, it's financed by the private companies, and we provide the land. Usually, the standard contract that we allow the companies to use the land is 10 years contract. So we provide the land, and we set up the signs and reserve it for EVs on public land. For the private ground, we don't really interfere with that. And the private operators, they, as in Sweden, I guess they finance it mainly themselves, but also with sometimes a little support from the national level. Not that much anymore, but they used to, and some EU projects also as well. So yeah.
Do you want? Yeah. And I could also add that the Nordic electricity market is very highly deregulated, which can sort of facilitate these types of innovative partnerships. Like you have land, and then you sort of couple up with other actors that want to provide the service. So that's what you always also have. Oh, take the mic, please, so I can get. Yeah.
So this dilemma is there. So if there is strong public funding, there is nothing like that. So in case if we open up the charging infrastructure for private players as well, though the land comes for free from the government, so but the revenue for the private person for putting up the infrastructure, so in the beginning may not be so attractive. Maybe as the years move on, it would be attractive. So this is the kind of discussion going on. So that's why I wanted to understand.
I think you're right. I think it's very hard to make any money really on the charging infrastructure at the moment. I think it's to some extent marketing money that goes into this, and it's something that they see a market coming. But I don't think it is quite they're used to the charging facilities in Stockholm. Taxi uses them a lot, also career companies, and also private people, of course, and business people. And we can see an increase. It's like doubling from one year to another, but also the amount of cars has doubled throughout the year. So that's probably part of that. But if a larger amount of the fleet would be electric, then later on, and I'm thinking I know in Norway at some of the charging units, they're actually making a profit now. But I won't say that's happening in Stockholm yet, but it's probably they see it coming. Mm-hmm.
Any other incentives given to the private? Like you clearly said, that advertisement
Yeah, I will just repeat the question for to get the people online as well. You were asking if it's any particular money given to this marketing, sort of in this financing, for this purpose, or yeah.
No, like for the private player, the any other incentives, like in the presentation it had come out that the normally the advertisement right. So if you mean the marketing right as the advertisement right, or that's different.
I'm not sure I understand the
No.
question really.
See, for any private investor
Yeah.
to come and invest,
Yeah.
so apart from the user charges,
Yeah.
there would be like other incentives that comes up from the government side, like the right to advertise.
Or the right to advertise. Well,
Yeah, so any other things
well, it's
like
not
this.
in Stockholm. It's not really. I've seen in other cities that these can be turned into advertisement places, or more or less. But I mean, it's really clearly that it's E.ON, Vattenfall, or Fortum at the moment who has put them up. But they're not super bright colored ones. But I mean, it does say on them, and I think it's part of their marketing, and also they want to have a large market share in the future, so they are eager to start early. So I think that's why they are doing it. But actually, the question should be placed to them if you really want to know the insights. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to all.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah. Jürgen there.
Hi, my name is Jürgen Sinning. I'm from a private charging operator, E-Ways. I have a question to Malmö. The strategy of pushing all the electric vehicle charging into parking houses doesn't really promote the inhabitants of the city of Malmö to get an EV. How does your thinking go about that?
That's an interesting question. First of all, our main focus is to get the inhabitants of Malmö to bike more, to take the public transport more, to walk more. That's our primary focus in our mobility plan. And furthermore, we see a lot of conflicting interests at the public streets and in public spaces. And we think it's important to keep our options open in that perspective. It's also, in general, a strategy to get more cars into parking facilities instead of having them on the streets. So it's not only a strategy that deals with electric vehicles at all, but even if it's an electric vehicle, it's still a car, right? So you have some sorry to be negative, but some negative impacts on the city, the possibilities for an attractive city, right? So that's our choice at the moment. But I understand the question perfectly well.
But it's interesting because you said, for instance, that putting up a lot of charging actually make it more visible and people realize that this is something coming. And we can see, for instance, with the multifamily houses that have put up charging, usually it's just one or two drivers in the beginning who are interested, and they just put up 1 or 2 units in the garage in the basement, and then the neighbors start to see, oh, okay, is this possible? I would like to have one as well. And then the multifamily home have to do it all over again and put up an additional 5 or 10 or something like that. So my advice to multifamily housing is to see how much is the capacity in your building, how much can you put up without, and you can use you can use equipment to balance the load, and you don't have to upgrade the facility, but still maybe put up 10 charging points. So do that then, because that's, the neighbors are going to start to get interested. And this is the debate that we have also in Stockholm. How should we use the public land, and what's good and what's not? And actually, we would like to use a lot of bus lanes and bike lanes, and we don't like to have the charging poles standing in the way of a biking lane. But we have looked at it in another way, because we have looked, okay, we're going to put up 500 units. Where are the best locations for that on street? To choose those. Don't choose the big, where we know there's going to be a bike lane, because you're probably going to have parked cars on street in Malmö 10 years from now as well. So choose the spots that are still going to be there in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, we're looking into that as
Yeah.
well, geographically.
But it's hard. It's
yeah.
hard to know.
Yeah.
You want to do something good, and it's a large investment. You start digging in the streets. You don't want to start digging it up again once the EV drivers have found the spot and so on. So, yeah.
We also have the issue of the legal framework in Sweden, which is quite complicated when it comes to public spaces.
I think that's where you have a dilemma, because
Yes.
I know your lawyer.
Oh yeah.
We don't agree.
Hello, Emma.
The jurisdiction people in Stockholm have
Yes.
other opinions
Yes.
than the ones in Malmö. So I think that's part also how you interpret the regulations.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
Then I have a question. Have you seen any legislation in Norway and Denmark, for example, that you want to copy here to Sweden? To promote?
No, I haven't really studied the legislation. I have had enough trouble with the Swedish legislation. And then also, when it comes to that term, it's not us to change the law, so we have to talk to the government and to those legal bodies within Sweden to have them to change the regulation. And we're not really speaking with one tongue here either, because different cities are interpreting it in different ways. So it is quite complicated also to have like a uniformed opinion. Yeah. So that's probably why I think we're solving it a little differently here and there, because it's,
Yeah.
We do
Interesting.
actually have
Yeah.
a new parking regulation in Norway now, where everybody who offers parking to the general public needs to have a sufficient number of charging points in their parking lots or parking garages, and it's at least 6% of all parking spaces.
that's good.
But we have a small difficulty with knowing who's actually enforcing and who's counting the number of parking spaces and charging spaces.
Yeah.
But we're working on it. So we at least have the general framework in action. We also have a framework for making it mandatory for all new apartment buildings that are being built to have sufficient number of charging spaces in the housing.
I think that's very important,
And
because
that
once
is-
you built the house, it's very easy and not very much more costly to put up charging to a certain amount of. And I mean, that was actually proposed to the Swedish government already in 2013, and nothing has happened. That I'm aware of. So there should be, like, also on a national level in Sweden, I think that you actually, if you build something new, you should at least put up at least a certain amount of charging.
EU puts forward this in a new directive.
That's true. And when's that going to be enforced then?
Pretty soon. The English text was out now the 14th of May.
Yes, it was out the 14th of May, and it's not implemented yet. But from the day of implementation, maybe or presentation, I mean, it has to be enforced in 20 months time.
20 months. Okay.
So it's quite soon.
But I also
after it's
I also know,
presented
I'm
fully.
aware of in Sweden, for instance, a lot of the big housing companies that built a lot of new, they already do 10 or 15%, because they are aware of you might as well do it when you build something new. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say that you have a problem with sort of following up these parking spaces, but do you have an idea where sufficient number of charging points are?
A little bit difficult to say, but I was in a recently built apartment building just outside of the Oslo border. 2 weeks ago, watching the Eurovision finals, and we were walking downstairs into the parking garage afterwards, and I see these rows of charging stations that are put up on the walls, and there aren't that many EVs. There are maybe about 5 EVs, but it was like 40, 50 parking spaces that had the charging boxes ready on the wall. And I asked my friend who's living there, I asked, did all of the parking spaces come with these charging boxes standard, or no? And he said, no, you have to pay 2,000 euros extra to get them on the wall. And so many, like half of the tenants there chose to pay those 2,000 extra euros to get their charging point on the wall, even though they don't have an EV right
Just
now,
Okay.
but because to be prepared for the
Yeah.
future. So I was really surprised to see the amount of charging points and to see that so many people are actually considering and seeing the value of having home charging.
Yeah, it's starting to be a selling point also in Stockholm, because you can see in apartment advertisements that they would say, okay, we have charging, and charging is it's available in our compound and so on.
Oh, interesting. And speaking, sort of, you can do certain amount on city level, where probably a big market growth comes from the national incentives. We talked a little bit about Denmark, that you had sort of policies removed
Yeah.
that kind of had conflicted. Do you see an uptake of that now? I guess a lot of people in Copenhagen will be the first buyers that are back when the policies are back.
Yeah, actually the policy hasn't changed that much, but there's been a lot of uncertainty about the legislation there. First, the government decided that the exemption from taxes should be phased out. So I think it was decided that by 2015 it should be 20% tax, then 40%, then 65%, then 90%, and then up to 100% tax by 2020, I think. That has been set on hold now, so it's staying on 20% now. I think it's also something to do with the communication, because all the debate about taxes on EVs has made people hesitant to, all the uncertainty, it makes people hesitant to invest in EVs, because tomorrow it might be much more expensive or much cheaper, so we don't know what to work with here. So right now it's set to 20% until for the next 5,000 cars at least, but that's a very limited still. And after that, it's supposed to rise again, but that might change with the new when there's a new government, because there's at least there's promises there, and that it should be prolonged in some way. But the communication itself has made people confused, I think, and so the Danish EV Alliance has changed the story from focusing a lot on the political issues. The government should do something now. It needs to be cheaper to buy an EV. So people are saying, okay, it must be expensive to buy an EV. So now, recently, they changed their story to saying, okay, hey, changing on the positive stories instead, saying, okay, it's not that more expensive to buy an EV right now. You should, and actually, I think it's resulted in a minor increase in sales, but it's still nothing compared to Oslo or Norway. But I think there's something to do with the communication at least. But I think there's really a need for some set lines, some decisions that are long-lasting decisions here in the national legislation, and I think that's what's been lacking in Denmark.
Yeah, but it's also a little bit problematic, because even on a national level, you have the conflict between promoting cars at all, same thing as you have in the cities, and it's a mix here. I just want to pass the question out to the audience again. Do you have any questions? Otherwise, we can go on like this for like 2 hours. So if you have any questions, yes. Please pass the mic.
Hi, I'm Peter Beckström from SunDrive. I have a question to Oslo. You have done a lot, and have you been able to register an improved air quality in the city of Oslo?
We have seen a reduced emissions and a better air quality, but it's also dependent on a few different factors, sort of generally the climate and how harsh the winter has been. And we sometimes, since Oslo is sort of shaped like a valley, we sometimes get these polluting fog layer that stays above the city, which contributes to worse air quality. But I believe the numbers that I saw from this winter was that the air quality was improved. But I'm not an air quality specialist, so I'm not going to say for certain.
That is due to the electric vehicles.
Yeah, I won't say that. We do have a few different other factors as well. We're reducing, we have incentives so that people can switch out their regular fireplace with a more clean burning fireplace. We also have a studded tire fee. So if you drive with studded tires into the city, you have to pay more. We also last year got higher fees for driving into the city during rush hour. So if you drive through the toll ring in the rush hour, it's about 10 or 15 kroners more than besides the rush hour peak.
So there are many different incentives targeting towards the same goal.
Yeah.
I have another question. Now, lots of cities, or several cities, there are also introducing electric buses for public transport. Is it a possibility that the charging infrastructure for these buses also can be shared by private companies with goods transportation? Is that an option? Is it possible legally, or is it even discussed? Because this investment is, I suppose, must be done by the city. Or what's the status in this question?
Yeah, in Stockholm it is discussed, definitely. Stockholm Public Transport is doing currently an internal investigation where they look into the different possibilities to have electric vehicles in the inner city of Stockholm. So they're talking about 300 buses at the maximum, at least in the beginning then, because those are buses that are working in the inner city and don't have, have ranges and are possible to exchange with existing technologies. But then there's different ways of charging them. It could be home charging or depot charging. It could be also charging at the end stations, and it could be charging on the run or on the go. And if you would decide to charge on the go, then of course trucks could most likely use the same type of charging infrastructure, at least at various places. But so that would be a benefit of using that type of charging technologies. Of course, sometimes we have bus lanes, and if they are dedicated to buses, then it could sometimes be hard to maybe also allow trucks in there, but maybe it can be. So it depends on where you are. And when that is discussed, it's discussed in terms of that there should also be some kind of battery in the buses so that you can do some tour on charging and then you can release and then go off, and you have a battery capacity to go off, and then you can go on again. And if you choose maybe the main streets or very big streets for this, then trucks could do the same. It'd be harder for the trucks to charge at the bus end stations, because that would be like a bus stop, and you don't really want to mix that. And of course, if you're in a bus depot, then you're in a depot for buses, so that wouldn't work either, really. So, the possibilities definitely are discussed, but it's a long way.
Mm-hmm. The bus charging infrastructure that we have in Oslo, or the one that I've seen, you have this
pantograph,
that comes, so that can't be shared with regular cars. But we are looking into a building project next year, since we're the green capital. We have a larger street in the center of the city that will be refurbished, and where it's planned to have bus charging and taxi fast charging. And we're also looking into building, when we're rebuilding that street, to make use of all of the electricity needed to actually use electric construction machines to use the electricity first, and then you have the electricity there and you can use that for the bus charging and the taxi charging afterwards. So it will be a fossil-free construction site. Interesting.
The electric grid is a narrow sector concerning feeding the fast charger for the buses. And we all know about vehicle-to-grid technology. Is it a possibility to find some project where private companies with a lot of personal staff cars are parked during working time and connected to the grid for charging during the day. These could supply the electric grid with power for fast charging of the buses. So some kind of cooperation and coordination of these questions between private companies and the public transportation must be very fruitful.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any such project in the pipeline, or is it already running? What's the status in this question?
Who wants to answer?
Well, we're not doing that at the moment, but it's very interesting for the future, I would say. But we're actually still happy to get electric buses on the streets. We're at that point where we should get that working, but still no, we're not looking into the freight side of it. No, not at the moment, but it's interesting.
You're right that capacity-wise, that's what we're looking into. And in Stockholm, Stockholm Public Transport has the electricity grid for the subways that they own themselves. So that's a big possibility that might what they want to use for the buses as well. But nothing is decided. And then there's, of course, it's the grid also, the regular grid of Stockholm that can be used. So. But I have not heard about, I mean, we're all talking about vehicle to grid, yes, but not in the perspective that the public transport company are joining together with some big car owners or electric EV owners. But I'll bring that with me.
Might be a good European project then.
Could be.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions? No, then I have a last one. It's a little bit more. What have you learned anything interesting today from the other cities that you might want to bring home to your city and like start to think about it? Interesting to see if you have learned something new too. Max, you want to start?
Of course. No, but I'm mostly, without thinking that much, mostly I'm impressed by the strength of your commitment and development, which we have seen in your cities. We're kind of a bit more, as I said, we're a bit more cautious, thinking more than doing at the moment. So I'm very impressed. That's overall my reflection.
Thank you.
Well, I really liked your map, Eva, so I might need to copy that one and get some more details on that one. And I also like the parklets that the Copenhagen are building. We're also working on reducing the number of cars in the city center of Oslo, getting rid of a lot of the general parking in the city center. So I know that I have some colleagues working on parklets that will really like your photo from the streets that you're converting.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was interesting as well. And I also always get inspired when Marianne speaks because they're so high up. And you have, I've been to presentations before where they have named you the charging queen of Europe and things, and you always do more and more and more every year that we see each other. So I think that's very inspiring to hear. And I also think that you talked about electric bicycles and so on as well, and that's actually something that we also have started to work with, that you don't always need to have a car, and I think that's very important to remember. And we got 2 electric cargo bikes to my unit that we now have others within the city, fleet managers within the city can use them for 2 weeks for their personnel to test. And we put it up on our intranet, and it took like 4 hours, and they were like booked until October. So there's such a large interest, and we can now see that we can exchange cars with cargo bikes, which I think it's very good. So yeah, I think that's to promote that, even also not always talk about cars, is very important to give the whole perspective, which I think all of you did, and I did not mention that at all. And I think that's very important.
Thank you. And Kasper?
Yeah, I think in Copenhagen we have to be very jealous of all the political ambitions, especially in Norway. All the incentives that makes it the obvious choice for people to choose an electric car instead of a fossil-driven car, and I think when we have the political debates in Copenhagen, it always goes a lot around. Okay, do we lose revenue when we are reserving these parking spots, for example? And there's maybe a sort of a fear to upset the citizens, and then also with for example, we had an example with the electric taxis in Copenhagen. We had a discussion there when we wanting to set up these fast chargers around Copenhagen, and we sort of make an analysis where would it be a good places to set up the infrastructure, and then our state architect said that hey, you cannot place it in the central city, but because they are ugly, they are really large fridges that you put around. So there's sort of a weighing between the aesthetical side of the infrastructure, and we got a visit from E.ON in Sweden, and they had set up these in Stockholm and right in the central city, and there was sort of the will there was much bigger to set up something to provide real incentives for example for the taxi business. So I think setting the, I mean, one thing is deciding political strategy like being CO2 neutral in Copenhagen by 2025, but it has to go along with real. It has to follow with some real tough decisions as well. Maybe raising the price of parking in general, maybe especially for fossil-driven cars. And this is in Copenhagen. We have quite a large share of biking. But if we have to reach our goals here, we know we have to just not use only the carrot, but also use the whip for people, and make harder regulations in order to get there. Of course, there are some limitations on what we can do from a national level. We are not allowed to make a toll ring from the national level, but at least, for example, the parking prices is something we can do, but it's so far the politicians have been very hesitant. And what we saw with the toll ring, I think, in Stockholm was that it was immensely unpopular in the beginning, but people have gotten used to it, and it's sort of maybe it's just having the courage to take the tough decisions, even though it might be unpopular at the beginning. So I think that's something to be inspired from in Copenhagen.
Interesting. Right, I give you one last chance, otherwise we'll give them a big round of applause again. No questions, so big rounds of applause. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. There, and we have some there. And that's for you. Thank you. Varsågod. And there are also lunch served in the atrium, the use room outside for those who are hungry. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.